Hello, and welcome to the second week of the Atlantic Slavery and Abolition module. This week we'll be building on the historiographical context we established in the first week and start actually exploring the historical context of the Atlantic slave trade. What were the religious, social, and economic situations found in different parts of the Atlantic world before slavery had begun? And how and why did it emerge in the way that it did? So, to begin with, we're going to have to start with the uncharted Atlantic Ocean. Before the 15th century, there had been relatively little activity throughout the ocean itself. There had been a couple of successful missions from Vikings in the mid 10th century from Scandinavia over to North America, but they never returned, and there was no record of it in Europe at the time. So, as far as Europeans were concerned, the Atlantic was completely unexplored. But that all changed in the mid 15th century. And what we're going to do now is explore why people originally started to explore the ocean. And there's really one major event that happens that defines the origins of Atlantic slavery and exploration. And that is the 1453 fall of Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. The reason this particular battle is one of the most important events in European history is because of its geographic position. You can see its position on the bottom left of your screen. The darker red area, which is Macedonia, has a dot in the middle. And Constantinople, or Istanbul as it is known now, has always been known as the gateway to Asia. And whoever was in control of the city had access to the lucrative markets of the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads, which led from eastern China all the way through India, the Arabian Peninsula, and into Eastern Europe. And for the vast majority of the classical period, Constantinople had been controlled by the Byzantine Empire, who were essentially the remnants of the Roman Empire and practiced Christianity. So the Christians in Constantinople would trade eastwards and reap the benefits of the lucrative markets there. However, in 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror, who was an Ottoman Turk and was leading an Islamic religious crusade, managed to take Constantinople with superior firepower and cannons. And 1453, by many historians, is considered the end of the medieval period. It is such an important date. And as the European leaders no longer had access to travel east, they needed to find new forms of income and food. And whilst there was some limited trade with North Africa, there had primarily been wars between Christians in Europe and Muslims in North Africa. So the only real option to monarchs was to explore westward across the uncharted Atlantic. Now, there were several pros and cons for doing this. The pros being potential financial gains, the complete lack of other options to other markets. There was also a desire to spread Christianity, especially by the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs. And finally, for a lot of the explorers who wanted to head west, personal glory. And you'll find that a lot of these early explorers were either incredibly desperate financially or a little bit mad. However, there were several serious obstacles in traversing the Atlantic in this time period. The obvious one being no one had mapped it before, no one knew what they were sailing into. Secondly, was a lack of funding. A lot of the European leaders by the end of the medieval period had been involved in costly wars against other feudal nations, and they really couldn't afford to engage in a possibly economically disastrous mission with no return. And then finally, and a really important factor, is finding people who were willing to take part on these missions. In early modern religious theology, lots of people believed that hell was a physical place that existed on earth to the south and west. So people were unwilling to join these missions because they felt it was a suicide mission, which is one of the greatest sins you could commit in early modern Christianity. But eventually, an individual managed to get money by going to two of the richest monarchs of the time, Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, and get their mission approved. Now, why did Cristoforo Colombo, or you will probably recognize him from the Anglicanized version of his name, Christopher Columbus, why did he want to do this? There were several reasons. He had grown up in Italy, born in Genoa, and his family was explorers. They owned ships, as many people did on the coastal towns of Italy, and he eventually married into a Portuguese family. Now, the Portuguese were one of the few nations who actually had experience traveling in the Atlantic Ocean as they skirted along the northwestern coasts of Africa, trading with nations that are where Guinea and Ghana are now. Now, Christopher Columbus fancied himself as a bit of a philosopher, an astronomer, and a geographer. And he believed that he had used ancient Persian calculations to work out the circumference of the Earth. However, he had failed to acknowledge that a Persian kilometer is different from a European kilometer, so his estimates were horribly off. I'm just going to show you the map of the world that he expected. So, what you have on this map, the yellow continents are what people at the time thought the world looked like. The blue arrow you can see is pointing towards a small island. That's where they thought Japan was. And Christopher Columbus believed that if he was given enough money and resources and manpower, he could access the Indian and Asian markets by sailing west instead of east. Now, of course, we now know that between Europe and Japan is an entire continent, which I've slightly clumsily outlined in red for you. So when Columbus was aiming for Japan and then the Indian and Southeast Asian islands, he ended up bang slap in the middle of the Caribbean. And what he found there was extraordinary, although he continued to refer to them as Indian islands and the natives there as Indian people because he refused to acknowledge the mistake that he had made. And we have a series of letters he writes back to Spain about how successful he had been and that he had found a paradise on earth, large land masses and series of islands of beautiful beaches and exotic flora, fungi, and animals. When he arrives in on the first Caribbean island, the locals, who are much less technologically advanced and have no real sense of government, believe Columbus and the Europeans who have greater technology to be gods. They believe them to be celestial beings and they worship them as such. And as a result, Columbus gets a god complex. And it is not very long before he writes back to Spain saying that he is converting the people to Christianity and that there is an untapped um, mine of resources, precious metals, and he mentions slaves to fortify the Spanish kingdom. And he describes the locals as being simpletons that need rule. So this is the very early origins of racial social structures, white individuals believing they are superior to non-Caucasian groups. But Columbus is not the only explorer, and after his successful adventure and the lucrative rewards that go back to the Spanish kingdom, which really cements their dominance as one of the European superpowers, other nations begin to send explorers into the Atlantic for the promise of rich rewards. And another really interesting explorer is the German born Hans Staden, who takes part of a Portuguese crew who end up in Brazil. Now, Hans Staden has a very different experience to Christopher Columbus, and he's captured, or he claims that he is captured by a group of cannibals. And what Hans Staden does is write up his experience of these cannibals, and he documents them. And when he eventually supposedly escapes, he writes up a story called The True Story and Description of a Country of Wild, Naked, Grim, Man-Eating People in the New World, America. And like some of the accounts that come out of the Caribbean islands, there are tales of cannibalism, of demonic creatures, of people with tails. So we know that not everything he says is true. But what is important is not just the transfer of people and goods across the Atlantic, but is the information that is being disseminated by these explorers. In the previous century, 1439, the Gutenberg printing press had revolutionized printing matters, and the creation of movable type allowed for mass production of books. Now, by the time that Hans Staden produced his work, books were being produced and distributed throughout Europe, and Staden became a bestseller. His story of the savage natives in Brazil became a very popular anecdote, as did Columbus's escapades, where he retold his experiences with the simpletons of the Caribbean islands. But either way, there were two main accounts of natives in the supposed New World: simple people who needed to be controlled, or savages who needed to be defeated. So you can see how Europeans started to fear non-white groups because of the accounts of these explorers. And this exchange of information and people and resources coming out of the New World is the beginning of the globalization process, which is the process of intercontinental integration arising from the interchange of worldviews. And one of the most horrendous products of this early globalization in the 15th, 16th century is that diseases brought to the New World by Europeans decimate local populations. Tuberculosis, yellow fever, and malaria destroy approximately 20 million lives in the Aztec population in less than a century. So that is modern day Mexico. And this disease of the locals is seen by many as God's wrath against a lesser species. So for many Europeans, they are seeing themselves as God's instrument in settling these new lands. And what develops is European countries vie for control of these new products, and a new economic system is formed that is different from the medieval feudal system. It is known as mercantilism, and it's quite complex, and I'll go through it more in the seminar. If you could do a little bit of reading about that beforehand, it would be useful, but I will be going through this. So, mercantilism is essentially the belief that the global economy is finite and that every country within the global economy is fighting to control its proportion of the money in the world. And that if someone else is increasing their wealth, that means your country's wealth is reducing. It's a very simplistic and slightly inaccurate way of looking at things. But the countries of Europe begin aggressive campaigns against one another to take control of the resources in the Atlantic world. And what you get in the early 17th century is um, formal legal trade groups being established who are trying to monopolize certain trade routes, certain products, and certain people. Some of the earliest of these are the Dutch East India Company, as well as the British East India Company. And they take control of certain pathways throughout the world. So the Dutch really start to monopolize the west coast of Africa, which runs along the Atlantic. The Spanish and the Portuguese extensively monopolized the areas of South America, which is why those countries now speak primarily Spanish and Portuguese. But the English and French are also vying for control in this new system. And it is in the 1670s when you begin to get companies that are um, established specifically with controlling slaves and certain populations. Um, and within the first 2 decades of the 1672 Royal African Slave Company being established, 100,000 slaves are processed, which is an unbelievable rate. And what the European countries do, they go to local leaders and exchange money and goods and services for people. One of the unfortunate truths of the African slave trade is that local leaders in Africa were willing participants in it. A lot of the time, it wasn't Europeans invading Africa, it was simply them trading with local leaders who didn't care about their population. And it's really important to acknowledge that African slavery had existed for millennia before Europeans turned up. But the nature of the Atlantic slave trade changed this system drastically. So I've included a number of different forms of slavery that existed in Africa before Europeans turned up, because they are very different kinds. The North African countries of Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt had something called chattel slavery, which was dominated by, firstly, pirates who would go to other countries and take them, and then those slaves would be included in domestic servitude as house slaves, servants. Eunuchs were popular, so cutting people's genitals off to make sure they weren't a sexual threat to the women of the household. And there were actually around 35 to 40,000 Christian slaves in Algeria by 1600. So it wasn't a small trade. West African slavery was very different, though. This wasn't a domestic servitude. They often went into Central Africa um, and took people of the areas which is now the modern day Congo, because the West African countries' religion of voodoo required human sacrifice. Then in East Africa, slaves were more agricultural to work in the fields of Ethiopia. So you have lots of different forms of slavery that exist in Africa before Europe turns up. What Europe does is exploit these systems, and the numbers drastically increase after Europeans engage in it. So, on top of everything we've discussed so far, the new economic systems, the social and religious views of race that are forming, you have in the 17th century the European scientific revolution, where methods of proof are being used increasingly to prove things instead of just belief in religious doctrine. And you have a number of scientific studies that reinforce racialized views and are used by many to justify the slave trade. So, one of the first is by Francois Bernier, who writes in 1684 an important and scientifically completely inaccurate reclassification of the earth by the different species or races of men that inhabit it. And Francois Bernier outlines that these Africans and Central Americans are not different races, but they are different species. Like, and in that way, they are almost treated as animals, like a dog or a pet. So that justifies the slave trade, that there is a natural social order in which Caucasian Europeans are at the top of it, and their technological and political systems are proof of their dominance and greater intelligence. In the 18th century, you have Johann Friedrich Blumenbach builds on this work and divides the human species into 5 races, which are Caucasian, Mongoloid, Malay, Negroid, and American. And what he does, he studies skull sizes, muscle mass, and he concludes that Europeans, once again, are the superior race. Now, it is of no surprise that white Europeans would come to these conclusions, but their findings are completely inaccurate. And his outlining that African men are more sexually aggressive, are less intelligent, are completely wrong. But these views take hold and it allows countries to justify the things they are doing. And that's where we're going to pick up next week, where the British and French colonial empires really begin to gain traction and take over the earlier Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires. I've left the main points of this lecture on this slide, so you can make a note of that later. Just pause and write that up. But what I want you to do and think about before the seminar next week is think about the following questions. Why were Columbus and Staden's accounts of natives so different? Columbus speaks of a placid, simple race of individuals, while Staden is talking about a hyper aggressive, demonized group of people. I also want you to think about what the strengths and weaknesses of these sources and accounts are. How much can we trust them? Secondly, I want you to think about what was the most important commodity to control in the early modern Atlantic world. What was the vital things a country needed to control? Thirdly, I want you to think about what was the impact of mercantilist theory. Now, this is a little bit difficult, and I will go in, as I've said before, go into more detail. But I want you to think about that. How did this mercantilist theory influence Atlantic society? Then I want you to think about how slavery existed in Africa before European influence. But in what ways did the colonial powers change the nature of the slave trade? Then finally, what was the role of the scientific revolution in slavery? And I do want you to read a journal for me, which is available on JSTOR. I want you to read Asselin Charles's Colonial Discourse Since Christopher Columbus, which is an excellent and clear dissection of how colonial attitudes have changed since Columbus's mission. So read that and we will discuss it in the seminar next week. If you have any questions for me, please just get in touch via my email, which I included in last week's lecture. Thank you.